We're here in Geneva, in Switzerland, at the Overcoming Inequalities in a Fractured World conference hosted by the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development.
I had the pleasure to speak with some of the speakers. Enjoy this mini-series about inequalities.
Hello, I'm Jonas Pontusson. I am a professor at the University of Geneva and I work in political science.
Thank you so much for joining me. You are at the conference about overcoming inequalities. What is the topic of your presentation?
I'm going to talk about advanced countries or rich countries, mostly North America and Europe. And I'm going to present research that I'm doing now or just started doing, which is about political dimensions of inequality and why governments are more responsive to some citizens than others. So I think in addition to economic equality, about which we know a lot, there is an important political dimension. Economic inequality, which has risen in most countries, has important political implications, not only in terms of who participates, but who is prioritized or given more voice by political parties and by governments.
What is political inequality?
So I think political inequality in an academic sense or in my area of research means that if we look at what citizens want in terms of policy changes or political changes, we can measure or we can ask citizens what they want, and then we can look at what governments do. And we can ask ourselves the question, do the support for policy change in some particular area among low-income or working-class voters, does it matter if 20% of them are in favor of a policy change or 80% of them are in favor of a policy change? So do their preferences predict something about what governments do? And we can do the same for high-income citizens. And the studies that we have so far at least tell us that whether high-income citizens, whether 20% support policy change or 80% support policy change, has a big effect on whether we will see policy change in the next 4, 5, 10 years. Whereas by contrast, if low-income citizens support policy change, it doesn't help us predict what happens. So we have some evidence that parties and governments are listening a lot more to affluent, well-educated citizens than they are to low-educated citizens. And then, of course, we don't exactly know why that is or how that works itself out, and that's what I'm trying to study. And I'm trying to do this in a cross-national sense of trying to look at different countries and ask whether this bias in the political process is bigger in some countries than in others. And maybe most importantly, I'm trying to see if this has changed, if it is the case that the voice of different kinds of citizens was more equal in, let's say, the 1960s and 1970s than it is today.
Which countries are you going to analyze and why?
A lot of people have already worked on the United States for this, and I'm not living in the United States, and so I'm trying to talk to literature in the United States, and there we know that there's a lot of unequal representation or unequal voice. We also know that in the United States, poor or low-income citizens are much less likely to vote. So I'm more interested in countries, European countries, including Sweden, which is where I'm from, where the distribution of economic resources is more equal, and though it has increased a lot, and where differences in voter turnout or participation in elections are not so big. And yet in Sweden too, we find that governments or politicians seem to be much more interested in what these people think and what they want. So Sweden is certainly one case that I'm very interested in. Switzerland is another case, very different political system, but I live here, I work here, and the people who work with me on this research are mostly Swiss, so Switzerland is certainly going to be part of the mix. And I'm interested in the United Kingdom and probably France and Germany. So those are the main countries. But we're also doing a survey that will look at about 14, almost all West European countries, 14 countries, where we will ask people about both about what their policy preferences are. We're asking about how important inequality is. Are they aware of inequality, rising top income shares? And we're also going to ask them, and I think we're probably the first survey that asks people about how they feel being represented, and do they perceive these gaps of representation. And I think we know that at least people who vote for populist parties probably do think that they are not very well represented in the political process.
What aspects are you most interested in?
One of the big things that have changed, especially for left parties, social democratic parties or labor parties, is that the people who are candidates for public office, and especially at the national level, less obviously at the local level, but at the national level, these people are now almost all university educated people, and they mostly come from white-collar professions, and that didn't used to be the case. So one of the things we're trying to do is to look at who are candidates for office and how has that changed over time, and how is that different in different countries, and is it the case that candidates for public office who come from working class backgrounds or who have been trade union members, which at least in Sweden used to be a very common path to public office, that you worked in a trade union and then you became a politician at some point in your life, whether those people are, to the extent that they're still around, are they more responsive? Do they behave differently in Parliament and ask different questions, have different policy priorities? So we will do surveys of parliamentarians, and some of those kinds of surveys already exist. And I think this has happened to many parties, but the change is most pronounced for traditional social democratic parties. And not only has the people who are politicians for them changed, but these parties have also become in their electoral campaigns relying much more on media rather than on party activists or party members. And I think everybody would probably agree that a big gap has opened up between the working class constituents of these parties and their leadership and their kind of way of doing politics. And it seems fairly clear from the evidence we have, at least, that many working class voters have abandoned these parties. They don't really feel. So my project is partly about what is happening to political systems and to democracies in general, but it is also very much about the crisis of mainstream left parties and why they are having such difficulties maintaining support of people who used to support them a lot, and who you would think have some interest in the kinds of policies that these parties claim that they represent.
You mentioned the media. What role do they play? On one hand, we have a democratization of them, but on the other hand, they are still dominated by the elite, right?
There is some research that says that social media and reliance on this more democratic form of media creates silos, or people only talk to people like themselves. And at least in the United States, the evidence seems to suggest that, or the argument is usually that this contributes to polarization, in the sense that Republicans only access media that has a Republican content, or they only communicate with Republicans, and Democrats the same. I'm not sure. I am interested in segregation, and I do think that media would be one aspect. Another aspect of segregation is obviously that people these days live in places that are more homogeneously white collar or upper middle class or working class, and in that sense I think obviously left parties, progressive parties that want to do something about inequality cannot appeal to low-income citizens. They also have to appeal to middle-income and middle-class citizens. And I think that for those kinds of reasons, partly perhaps to do with the media, but also very much or maybe more importantly, I think, having to do with where people live and where their children go to school. I think it's building common interests or framing redistributive policies as a common interest of many people is probably harder today than it was before. And there is no doubt that, as you say, elite dominance of a certain kind of media has, at least until recently, meant that certain kinds of social issues and things having to do with inequality have not gotten the coverage that it should have gotten. And to go back to what I was saying about left parties, I think that media makes these parties less reliant on local networks and local activists to reach out. And therefore they are in some sense the leaders or the elites that are run for office and are part of these parties are freer today. So there is, I think, two things that has happened and partly related to media. One is that middle class and working class citizens are perhaps less interacting with each other, have moved apart on certain kinds of issues, certainly when it comes to immigration and things like that. And the other thing has to do with the relationship between voters and politicians or candidates and so on. And there used to be party members that were the kind of connection between voters and politicians, and now parties have lost a lot of members. The British Labour Party is obviously an exception, and that I think is an important thing to note, but in many countries there is more separation between politicians and citizens, and parties have become less important, and media consultants have become much more important to the way these parties do politics.
Why is this happening, and what does it mean for democracy?
I don't have a single theory of this. I think that's one of the things that happened was obviously there is technological change, and it's perhaps inevitable, certainly with respect to media. Another important thing that I haven't mentioned yet is the decline of trade unions, and especially the decline of low-income private sector trade unions. Trade unions today are, in some countries, have held up fairly well, especially in the public sector. Trade unions are more white-collar today than they used to be. So there has been a decline of unions, but the decline of unions has not been the same in all sectors or for all categories of workers. And you could attribute some of that decline to technological changes and structural changes that are beyond anybody's control. Most obviously the decline of manufacturing and the fact that private sector low-wage work is increasingly in the service sector, in smaller shops, smaller places. So that has a big effect. But I guess my argument would be that much of what has happened to trade unions has been a result of political decisions that were taken, mostly by parties of the center right. But it's striking to me that left parties, when they come back to power, have very rarely reversed those decisions or changed things in ways that would incentivize people or make it easier to organize trade unions. I think that's true of the Labour Party under Blair in the 1990s. There were a lot of reforms that Thatcher had introduced that could have been changed, and they were not changed. And it is also true of the Swedish Social Democrats when they returned to power in 2014. They don't change the reforms that had been introduced specifically to reduce trade union power. And I think that so one reason why some of this stuff happened, I think, is because of austerity and slow economic growth and the perception, and this is a very important thing, that a lot of the demands of low-income citizens cost money. Most of the demands of affluent citizens have to do with regulations, the freedom of taking your child out of a school and sending the child to a private school, or a lot of the demands of affluent citizens have to do with choice and regulations, and they can be accommodated in an austere economic environment in a way that maybe the demands of low-income citizens are more costly in some sense and more difficult to square with balanced budgets and the like. So there is something about the economic situation. I also think that up until recently, a lot of left parties and others thought that low-income workers or low-income citizens had nowhere else to go. It wasn't particularly interesting to appeal to them because they would vote for us anyway. The options were not good, and many of them didn't want to vote anyway, so if they stopped voting, that was not a major problem. And it was thought that these categories of citizens was a relatively small group of people who would probably, with the rise of the knowledge economy and with these transformations, would probably kind of continue to diminish, and therefore they were not a very important electoral. If we wanted to win the next election, it was much more important to win the support of these what political scientists call swing voters, who could just as well vote for the Liberals or for some other party to the center-right. So it was thought, I think, that one could ignore these people. And of course, it is one of the big lessons of the rise of populism, is that there are more people who feel unrepresented, who fit into these categories. There are more people, and they now think, foolishly perhaps, that they have options. And I think a big question becomes, can left parties reorient themselves? And if they do reorient themselves, can they win those voters back again? You know, it is often said about trust in a marriage that if you do things that lead your partner not to trust you, it is very difficult to regain that trust. And so, you know, can you put Humpty Dumpty back together again? Or, because I think, as you know, that they have done extremely badly in the last few elections, and that, I think that is not so much for my academic research, but from a more political and more general point of view, the big question for people like myself is, should we abandon these parties? Should we try to build other parties, or is there still some possibility of revitalizing them? And that probably varies from country to country.
Do we need the left parties? Or in general, what, in your opinion, could we do or should we do?
This is the nature of democracy, right? Elections do matter, and it is a good thing that the Democrats won control of the House of Representatives the day before yesterday. It has meaningful consequences. We cannot step back from that, I think. But obviously, and I think this is probably, certainly in the American case, I followed the election fairly closely, the most important thing is probably the changes that are taking place at a more local level. But it is electoral politics. Some of my friends who say, forget about electoral politics, should all be about organizing social movements, organizing communities, and sort of trying to correct things at a local level. And then there are other people who basically say, well, we just have to live with the parties that we that we are stuck with, and the elections do matter, so therefore we have to vote for these parties, and we have to urge other people to vote for these parties. And I guess progressive people need to find an intermediate position, and that position probably revolves around elections at the local level or at the regional level in the United States, at the state level, so that it's not just national elections or local activism, but that there is politics at a series of levels between those two extremes. And most importantly, that parties and reinventing or building new parties, and different people will make different choices, but that political parties are an important institution in electoral democracy. So we cannot sort of abandon a party electoral approach.
If you could change one thing tomorrow, what would it be?
So I would say one thing, but I don't think this is not a change we can do tomorrow. As you know, there's debate about basic income. I'm not sure that basic income is the solution, the magic solution. I think that the conversation, the political conversation, especially on the left, needs to change. I think we should talk opportunities matter, but I think that we need to build the safety net. We can afford this, whether it's basic income or other schemes. I think we have drifted too much towards talking about education and opportunities. I think education is important, but it's a long-term thing, and we need relatively quickly social policy reforms that address income gaps and address the income problems which low-wage workers and non-workers face today. And I think that that's probably, if I were running as a politician, I would talk about that. And then more long-term, encouraging unionization and restricting or increasing regulations on financial corporations and other corporations. But those, I think, we need to do something very soon, in my opinion. We don't have the luxury of thinking about reforms that will change the way democracies work 15 or 20 years from now. We do need to do things, and those things, in the first instance, have to do with what I would call compensatory redistribution, and that should be the focus.
Why do we need to do this now? Why the urgency?
Oh, because I think there will be no left parties left, and because I think a continued increase in populist support will have very bad consequences for all of us.
What is the most important thing that you have learned from your research and you would wish people know more about or think more about?
I think the most important change and thing that I have learned is the following, that it is not just the level of inequality that matters, but the structure of inequality is very important. And that if the poor become separated from the middle class, as has been happening, this undermines the basis for progressive politics. So in some sense, I am less worried about the top income shares, the top 1%, but from a political point of view, I'm much more worried about a growing gap between low-income citizens, workers, and the middle class, and that gap is what the left has to worry about.
Do you have a dream?
My dream is that we will ultimately, and I thought this would happen before I die, but it won't, but my dream is that we can create a society that is more equal and more tolerant, and that both of those things are important.
What is life about?
Life is about being the best I can be in my work, succeeding or doing as well as I can and doing better than some. So there is a kind of work competitiveness that motivates me. It's also about trying to be socially and politically relevant and trying to figure out ways that one could speak outside of this academic community that I'm part of. And then finally, and most importantly, life is about my family and my wife and my children.
Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for sharing. Next time, we are going to continue with our mini-series about inequalities. I hope to see you soon again. Bye and ciao.